Hi everyone, I am back with another PIO analysis video. Before we jump into the hand, a few quick things. First and foremost, thank you for the support on the previous video. I will be continuing to try to improve the production value of these videos for as long as people are watching them. Second thing, as I mentioned in my previous video, I'm not a PIO expert. I'm making these videos as a way to practice and feel productive when I'm doing studying in PIO, so I am open to constructive feedback. And the third thing is that I'm going to try to make these videos a little bit shorter. So for that reason, I'm not going to dissect every area of every PIO range. And so if you do want a deeper dive in any of those ranges, I recommend just pausing the video so you can browse the ranges. That way I'm not rushing through them. So jumping right into the hand here, this is a hand from day 2 of the main event. The hero and villain are both young 20-something regular players, haven't been playing for long, not many reads. And the big blind is the effective stack with just about 28 big blinds to start the hand with big blind ante. So the hero in this hand opens king queen to a little over min from mid position, and the big blind defends. The big blind then elects to check. The hero bets 2k into 6k, and the big blind calls. Turn is the 9, and it goes check, check. The river is the 6 of spades. The big blind checks. The hero bets 6,000 into 10,000. And the big blind goes all in for just over 22,000. So before I run this in PIO, I'd like to pose a question to the viewer, which is, as mid position here, assume that you bet flop, check turn, and then bet river this sizing with all of your strong one pair hands. So ace, ace, king, queen, ace, king, king, jack, maybe king 10 suited. And the question I'd like to ask is, how often with those hands are you going to be calling this check jam on the river from the big blind? Now I understand that some of these hands have different card removal implications, like king, queen. Blocking, for example, queen 10 is very different than aces, which doesn't block any of those potential bluffs. But in general, I'd like you to pause the video and think about how often you are calling with these strong one pair hands. Is it maybe half the time? Are you folding most of the time? Are you almost always calling? You don't have to, you don't have to tell me 56% of the time, but before we proceed with the PIO output, I want you to stop and think, how often are you calling this check raise with one pair of hands? So now we're going to run this in PIO. I don't want to spend too much time talking about like my bet sizings and the way I've set up the simulation on the left, but feel free to pause the video if you want to look at any of that. We're going to just jump right into the ranges. So the first we're going to start with the pre-flop raiser. This is the in-position player. I've given him a pretty standard 25% pre-flop opening range here. There's reason to believe he might be opening wider because he has a larger stack and there's some recreational players at the table. But I think this is pretty standard. I haven't discounted any of the hands here. We're just going to be assuming that this is the range that he's going to be raising with 100% of the time. So next we have the big blind defense range after the mid position, just over min open off of 28 big blinds. This is the range that I'm plugging in for the big blind here. Granted, I am not a I'm not an MTT expert. I come from a cash game background, so there certainly could be some issues with this, but for the most part, I think this is in the ballpark of what the big blind should be defending with. I'm going to assume that the big blind 3-bets aces, kings, ace, queen, 10s and jacks some percentage of the time, and then it's just going to be flatting a pretty wide range outside of that. So this is about a 40% flatting range. Maybe this is a little too wide or a little too tight, but it's certainly in the ballpark. So we're going to start here with the big blind's decision to check or bet on king 9-5 rainbow out of position. As you can imagine, the big blind is going to be checking this 100% of the time, pretty standard on a dry king-high board. It's worth noting before we get into the other outputs that have rounded strategies. So in other words, if PIO wants to do something 60% of the time, I've rounded it to either 0, 50%, or 100%. So for example, if PIO is betting something 80%, when you round the strategies, it'll just tell you to do that 100% of the time. Makes it a little bit easier to digest the output, and it does not significantly shave off any of the EV. So this is the first interesting decision in the hand. This is the in-position player's decision to bet or check the flop. I think a lot of people would assume on a dry king-high board, the in-position player can just c-bet their entire range for 1/3 pot. However, in this case, PIO is electing to use this 1/3 sizing 66% of the time. So for its nutted hands, for ace-ace, ace-king, king-queen, two-pair, things like that, it is betting almost 100% of the time. And with its draws, it is mixing some bets and some checks with its gut shots and things of that nature. And then with its air balls, so like ace high or, no pair, no draw, it's doing a mix of betting and checking. And then for hands like, the only really hands that it's going to be checking 100% of the time are 10-9 suited, pocket eights, and then ace-queen suited, so these kind of middling strength potential bluff catcher hands. But for the most part, it is a good, healthy mix of betting and checking here. I think one of the reasons that PIO is electing to mix on this board instead of just betting its entire range for 1/3 pot is because I think it's actually a deceptively dynamic board. Even though it's a dry king-high board, there are actually a lot of gut shots on this board. So 6-7, 6-8, jack-10, queen-10, things like that. And for that reason, on future runouts, the board can actually change pretty dynamically, especially if two middling cards come off on the turn in the river. And I think for that reason, because it's not like a lockdown board like king-3 deuce, or it's not a board that, the in-position player is going to have a solid range advantage on most runouts, I think that's why it is electing to mix here. But feel free to let me know if you think otherwise. Now, in response to this 1/3 sizing, the big blind is going to be folding all of its no pair, no draw hands, and it's going to be continuing with a raising range that includes some strong top pairs, king, queen, king, jack, etc. I think this is something that not many people do in reality. The solver actually attacks these 1/3 flop sizings by raising hands like top pair, but I think in reality a lot of regs will just be flatting their top pair hands. And then as far as its hands that it's continuing with a call, it's calling with all of its weaker top pairs, all of its middling pairs, all of its 5x, its 9x, and then it's including hands like gut shots, sometimes as a call and sometimes as a raise. It's worth noting that it is balancing out our value raises here. Our value raises are mostly king queen, king 10, king jack. Some percentage of the time it's going to have king 9, and it's going to balance those out by including some of the higher gut shots, so queen jack and jack 10 and queen jack as well. And then as far as what it's doing with these smaller gut shots, so like 8-6, for example, or what's the other gut shot? 8-6 or 8-7, I believe, is a gut shot. They're mostly calling. So this is how the big blind is responding. So in this hand, the out of position player elected to call the flop c-bet, and we see a turn that is the 9 of spades. Now, on the 9 of spades, the out of position player is going to have more 9x hands, and that's because they're going to have more hands pre-flop when they call out of the big blind that have a 9 in them, and they're also, and also the in-position player is going to be checking some of its 9s on the flop. So when they bet the flop, it means that they can't have some of those 9s if they are mixing that frequency. So because of these reasons, on this 9, the out of position player is actually going to be betting almost 40% of the time. It's going to be doing so with a range of all of its 9x hands, and then a mix of its high gut shots, so jack 10 and queen 10, and queen jack, and then its lower gut shots. It's 8-7, it's 8-6, and it's 7-6. And then as far as its checking range, the out of position player is going to be checking all of its showdown value, so ace jack, ace 10, 6-6, 7-7, weak top pairs, and it's going to be balancing out that checking range by throwing in some 9x hands as well. So it's worth noting here that some of these 9x hands it's going to check to protect its checking range. So in this case, the out of position player did elect to check, and now the in position player has a decision. Now this is a pretty complicated output that involves a large size, a small size, and a check. I think the key takeaway here is that PIO is betting most of its stronger kings, although it's checking hands like ace-king pretty frequently. And it's just going to be doing a lot of checking. So it's checking almost 60% of the time, and that's probably because this is a card that can favor the out-of-position player. If we look here, the in-position player, the pre-flop raiser, has 5,175 EV, But if we go back to the out-of-position player, the out-of-position player actually has more EV on this turn card. It has almost 7,000. If we look at the red-hot hotness, we can see that the 9 is the worst turn card by far for the in-position player. The next worst turn cards are 5s, 6s, and 7s, and I think that's because the out-of-position player is going to have a lot of those middling cards that they might make 2-pair, or they might make a straight on, and then the best cards are the bricks, so the deuces, and then also the high cards, the aces, the kings, and the jacks. So the 9 is significantly worse for the in-position player, and they're going to be doing a lot of checking even when check 2 here. Now in this hand, the in-position player did elect to check back the turn, and we see a river of the 6 of spades. Now on the 6 of spades, the out-of-position player is actually going to be overbet jamming for 2 times the amount of pot, about 20% of the time. So it's going to be overbet jamming with any of the 9x hands that it reaches the river with, and it's going to be balancing that out by also overbet jamming some percentage of the time with Jack 10 offsuit, Queen 10 offsuit. It's also using a smaller size with its King X hands that want to bet for value and its King 9 suited combinations that will block the opponent's bluff catcher. So maybe that's why it doesn't want to use a bigger sizing with King 9 suited. Now with most of its showdown value hands, its ace high hands, its weaker top pairs, its medium pairs, it is going to be checking this river 100% of the time, and it is going to be protecting that checking range by throwing in some combos of 6-6 and some combos of 5-5. So in this case, the out-of-position player did elect to check the river, and then the in-position player is going to be using this 2/3 sizing with all of their strong 1-pair hands to value bet the river. So these are hands that they bet the flop, check back the turn, and then they're going to bet the river with ace-king suited, king-queen, king-jack, king-10, things like that. And they're going to be balancing this betting range with some of their gut shots like queen 10 suited and queen jack suited. And then it's going to be checking back with all of its showdown value hands, so all of its ace queen, ace jack type ace high hands, as well as its pairs like jack jack and 10-10. And with its hands like 7-6 suited that make a pair on the river, pretty obviously it's going to be checking those back. And then all of its boats, it is also going to be sizing up. So in this hand, the in-position player elected to bet 2/3 pot. And now this is where it gets interesting. So what is the out-of-position player going to be doing versus this 2/3 sizing? Now, we can see that they are going to be calling with all of their top pairs, so calling with all of the King X hands that they reach the river with. I think this makes sense. These are fine bluff catchers. It's going to be folding its ace highs and, its total air balls. And then it's actually going to be jamming with a few combos of quads, a few combos of 6s full, a few combos of 5-6, and then it is balancing these river value jams with a sprinkling of 8-6 suited, 7-6 suited, and 5-6 suited. So it has strategically decided which suits within these combinations that it's going to raise with. So for example, it's using 7-6 of diamonds and 7-6 of clubs as a raise some percentage of the time, and then it's using 6-5 of clubs some percentage of the time. But in a nutshell, it's going to be check jamming the river with 9-9, 6-6, and 5-5, and then balancing it with 5-6 suited and 7-6 suited. So here is the plot twist in this hand. I was actually the big blind, and I had 5-6 of diamonds. I called pre-flop, I called the flop, I checked the turn, I checked the river, and facing this sizing, I was really tempted to go all in, but because this was my first main event, and because I had sort of an irrational fear of just punting it off or doing something stupid, I just elected to fold, but I was really tempted to go all in. And I think if we look at the PIO output, we can see that 6-5 of diamonds as a check jam on the river is actually more profitable than calling the river, and it's more profitable than folding the river. Now, in this case, PIO elects to call with the 5-6 diamonds and then raise with the 5-6 of clubs, but I don't think the suits are necessarily that important just because both of those are backdoor flush draws on the flop. So it is nice to see that even though I wasn't able to make this bluff, I was tempted to make it, and it is something that in an equilibrium, PIO supports. So to end this video, I want to circle back on the question that I asked at the beginning of the video, which was, as the in-position player, how do you think you're responding with your strong top pair hands when facing this check jam on the river? So this is the equilibrium response in PIO, and the equilibrium response is to obviously call with boats and straights, so all of your king, king, king 9, 8, 7, and 6, 6 hands, and then as far as your top pair hands, or your one pair hands, PIO is electing to fold with pocket aces, fold with about half of its ace-king hand, so it's calling with about half the time with ace-king, calling about half the time with king-10, and then calling, I think, a little more than half the time with about king-queen. So in other words, PIO is calling the river with its strong one-pair hands about half the time in a vacuum. So if you answer that you're going to be folding these hands like ace, ace, and king-queen about half of the time, you're pretty in line with the GTO frequency here. It's worth noting that hands like ace-queen and king-queen actually have a pretty negative EV. The EV of calling this $22,000, this 22,000 chip all-in bet is negative 5,000, but I think PIO is still continuing with them just so it can meet its minimum defense frequencies. But versus this equilibrium response of calling half of the time, villain is going to, the out of position player is basically going to be incentivized to keep equilibrium frequencies for its check jamming range, and basically check jamming with 6-6, 5-5, 9-9, and 5-6 suited as a bluff. But I personally think that there are a lot of regs out there, particularly the regs that aren't very good, or the regs that don't give you credit for being very good. I think there's a lot of situations in which somebody might fold their entire range versus this check jam. And that's because for the out of position player to check 3 times and then go all in on this river, where there are not really many natural bluffs, it is something that some regs might say, you know what, I don't think he's ever bluffing, I don't beat any value hands, so I'm just going to fold all of my one pair hands. And I think this is actually a pretty likely scenario. I think there are some people who may have answered at the beginning of this video and they might have said, look, I'm folding his hands most of the time. We don't beat any value. It's hard to be bluffing. He's going to have a lot of strong hands. He might have checked a 9 3 times. So I'm just going to fold all of my strong hands. So in order to see what happens in response to this population tendency, we're going to do a little bit of node locking. And let's assume that villain folds these one pair hands. Instead of folding them half of the time, what happens if he folds them, let's say, 80% of the time? So this is the output in which I have node locked its one pair hands like ace king, ace king, ace ace, and king queen. I've node locked it to fold 80% of the time. And now we're going to rerun PIO and see how the out of position player responds. So with this node locking, this is the out of position response. Instead of check jamming the river with 6-6, 5-5, and 5-6 suited, basically anytime we get to the river without showdown value, and even sometimes when we do get to the river with showdown value, the out of position player is going to be check jamming almost half of the time. So ace-5 suited, ace-5 offsuit, 8-8, 7-7, and basically anytime we get to the river with with most of our showdown value hands, we're just going to check jam all in because the villain is overfolding. And I think this is an example of a spot where if you think somebody might be overfolding, or if you think there's a population tendency to overfold, you can definitely attack. And personally, and feel free to, disagree if you don't think so, but I think on this board, I think a lot of regs might fold almost 80% of their one pair hands to the check jam on the river. I think if both players know that they are high level, top regs, then it's different. But when you're playing an unknown reg in the main event, you don't actually know if they're capable of bluffing the river ever, and there's always a chance that you're playing a reg that never check jams the river as a bluff. And so against certain players, like calling with king-queen offsuit here is going to be really bad. And because of that sort of that unknown dynamic between the regs here, I think this is a spot where you could certainly attack. In conclusion, does PIO approve of the 5-6 of diamonds check jam in a vacuum? The answer is yes. Next question is, if we apply population tendencies and some node locking, what are the implications? Well, the answer to this is, if villain folds more than 50% of the time with his one pair hands, we should actually check raise way wider than 5-6 diamonds. And as you can see here, the EV of check jamming a hand like 7-7 or ace-5 is pretty high. Like the EV of check jamming 7-7 is 3,800 chips, which is a lot given that we start at the hand with about 28,000 chips. Now, it's worth noting that I only node locked the river. I didn't node lock, for example, villain's c-betting strategy on the flop, and I didn't node lock any of their turns with the population tendencies, but I still think that this is an example of a spot where if I could go back, I probably would have check jammed, because there's the chance that villain is folding the overwhelming majority of their range on the river.